Track 1.
Okay, class, let's get started. Today we're going to talk about the structural functionalist theory in sociology. You guys remember last week we discussed the interactionist perspective, right? Okay, now that theory, the interactionist theory, focused on how people get along with one another and the way that interactions create behaviors. This theory, the structural functionalist theory, I'm just going to call it the functionalist theory, is very, very different. Now, we'll talk about the historical context of this theory a little bit later. But first, I would just like to go over the main tenets of the theory. The basic view of functionalism is that our behaviors and actions can be best explained by the role or function, if you will, that they perform for the society as a whole. Now, I know that may be a little vague. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at some different behaviors and then see how a functionalist would explain them. A good example would be drug use. A functionalist wouldn't really judge a drug user as a deviant or a bad person. Instead, the functionalist would try to figure out what role the drug user, the person, fills in society. This seems a little bit strange at first, I know, but just bear with me. So think about what role a drug user fills in society. You may automatically think that the role is always negative. Crime, the cost of treatment, maybe more jails. But the functionalist tries to see the positives as well. So I bet you're thinking that drug use doesn't have too many positives, right? Well, here's what a functionalist would say. While a drug user may be harming himself or herself, to be fair, he is also benefiting society. Having drug users means we need to have more police, which means obviously there are more jobs. And also, if you think about it, more doctors, nurses, and social workers, even drug counselors. So all of these people would be out of work probably if we didn't have a drug problem. So let's keep going, okay? So without drug users, we wouldn't need the entire drug enforcement agency. That bureau employs thousands of people across the country, and there's also the Border Patrol, customs agents, so on and so on. You get this? I think our example has given you a pretty good idea of how a functionalist views behaviors. Again, the important thing is that they don't really judge behaviors as good or as bad. They only view them based on their role or function in society. And I think we can probably guess then that to a functionalist, all behaviors, no matter how good or bad you may think they are necessary to our society. It's a pretty interesting viewpoint.
Track 2.
Hi, do you need help with something?
Yes, I'm supposed to use this program for my statistics class, but I'm not sure how.
Okay, do you have the program with you?
Sure, here it is.
Okay, well, let's bring it over to a computer and see how it works.
I think something's wrong with the program. When I tried to run it on my computer, nothing happened.
It's interesting. So let's see what happens here. It looks like it's running fine on this computer.
Weird. My computer freezes every time I try to open the program.
You mean the entire computer locks up? Have you had this type of problem before?
Yeah, I guess. Sometimes when I try to use certain programs, they just don't seem to work correctly. I don't know why, though.
You can always use the computers here in the lab. That way you don't have to worry about it.
I know, but I'd rather figure out what the problem is with my computer. The computer lab can be busy, and I need to work on this project often. It's going to be 1/3 of our grade.
What class is this for?
It's for Statistics 101 with Professor Lee.
And this program is required for the course?
Yep. Professor Lee even got the campus bookstore to stock a bunch of copies. That's where I bought it.
Do you use your computer for a lot of things? Maybe you should clear up some memory before you run the program.
Yeah, I've tried that actually. I do have a lot of programs on my computer, but I should have enough memory to run this program.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the problem could be, but you're welcome to use the program here.
Okay.
And you should definitely come back later and talk to my supervisor. She's a computer whiz. I bet she can solve your problem.
Track 3. Listen to a biology professor give a talk on an environmental issue.
Now, there's been a lot of talk over the last few decades about greenhouse gases. Those gases in the atmosphere that trap radiation from the sun so that after it passes into the atmosphere, it doesn't pass out. People are increasingly conscious of the environmental effects of their daily activities, which is a good thing. But all the publicity can be confusing too. I think writing for the general public about science is a real service. But, well, it's not nice to say, but I wish some of these people would verify things with real scientists more often. They'd save themselves some embarrassment. With that in mind, I'd like to clear up some things about that hot topic, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It absorbs energy from the sun. In that respect, it's like water vapor and methane, two other naturally occurring greenhouse gases. You all know that carbon dioxide is produced when we burn fossil fuels, coal, petroleum products, natural gas, and that those fuels run a lot of the machines and manufacturing processes that drive modern life. Those are the sources that get all the public attention. But, of course, we produce carbon dioxide as a waste product too. It's one of the byproducts of respiration. We breathe in air, we use up some of the oxygen, and breathe out air that contains carbon dioxide. So do other animals. Because carbon dioxide is part of the natural life cycle, nature has a way of dealing with it. How does nature control the amount of carbon dioxide floating around in the atmosphere?
Well, I thought the ocean soaked it up.
Yes, that's one way. Carbon dioxide is very soluble in water. Soluble, and I don't have to explain that one to you because the roots related to the word dissolve, right? So, carbon dioxide is pulled readily out of the air and into the water. Now, the oceans also release some of their carbon dioxide, but on balance, they absorb more. So that means if we produce artificially more than would naturally be emitted through life processes, the ocean could, as Jason put it, soak it up. Unfortunately, if we're looking for a solution to carbon dioxide pollution, the ocean isn't it. And that's because the ocean absorbs gases from the atmosphere very, very slowly. If we suddenly increased the amount of carbon dioxide we produced, current models suggest that it would take 1,000 years for it to mix into seawater. And even then, there would still be a small amount left. So over the short and medium term, we can't rely on the ocean to take up the slack for us. Okay, so that's one way nature deals with carbon dioxide. What's the other?
Plants, isn't it? I mean, plants breathe carbon dioxide the way we breathe air.
Sure. I was actually kind of surprised that wasn't the one mentioned first. Yes, plants require carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. The more dense the growth of large plants, the more carbon dioxide is absorbed. Such an area, including forests of large old-growth trees and also the ocean, where carbon dioxide is absorbed in large quantities, is called a carbon sink. The carbon dioxide gas is sucked in kind of the way water is sucked down the drain in your sink after you wash the dishes. In fact, in the ocean, there are algae, seaweed, other kinds of marine plants too that rely on carbon dioxide to perform photosynthesis, just like the green plants on land. It's just that algae are far, far smaller. Now, here's something interesting. Like the ocean, green plants release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as well as absorb it when a plant dies. You know, if it burns in a forest fire or just dies of old age and decays, then its carbon dioxide is back in the air. So it only holds it in over its lifetime. However, this is the interesting part. Unlike the ocean, green plants soak up carbon dioxide to use it to make the energy they need to live and grow. So what they found in some regions, populated, industrialized regions, is that increased levels of carbon dioxide can stimulate plant growth. There's more of the fuel that plants need for energy, so they grow more green and dense and lush and use more of it. In other words, the amount of carbon dioxide used by plants can increase quickly in response to the environment. Some people have suggested that we can use that natural phenomenon to help deal with increased levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere.
What is the discussion mainly about? What is the problem with relying on the oceans to solve the problem of excess amounts of carbon dioxide? What did the professor call areas where carbon dioxide is absorbed in large quantities? Why does the professor mention that carbon dioxide is a byproduct of respiration? Listen again to part of the discussion, then answer the question.
I think writing for the general public about science is a real service. But, well, it's not nice to say, but I wish some of these people would verify things with real scientists more often. They'd save themselves some embarrassment.
What did the professor mean by this?
I wish some of these people would verify things with real scientists more often. They'd save themselves some embarrassment.
Listen again to part of the discussion, then answer the question.
Soluble, and I don't have to explain that one to you because the root's related to the word dissolve, right?
What did the professor imply? How are plants different from the oceans in the way they track 4?
Hi, Kama, how you doing?
Oh, hi, Julia. I guess I'm okay.
Oh, what's going on? Is everything all right?
Yeah, I guess. It's just, I don't know. I'm having a hard time caring about much these days. I just feel down, but I don't know why. I haven't been sleeping well, and I just feel kind of down.
Have you thought about going to the Student Counseling Center? They're incredibly helpful. Last year, I was having a hard time with some family stuff that came up, and it was really nice to be able to talk to someone to help sort out what was going on in my head.
No, I don't like sharing my problems. I don't want people to think I can't handle life or something.
Yeah, I understand. But the cool thing about the folks there is that they're professionals. They're not the people you're going to see walking around campus, and they know that we all have stuff going on and sometimes just need some help to figure it out and get through it.
Yeah, I guess. But I bet it costs a lot. I just don't have much money to spend these days.
Actually, it's one of the resources we pay for with our student services fee every semester. I mean, there's a limit as to how often you can go in a semester, but at least you can get some kind of help at no extra cost.
I just feel like I'm lost and that no one will be able to help me. Do you really feel like it helped you?
I felt exactly the same way, and yes, I do believe that they were able to help. You'll never know if they can if you don't at least give it a shot.
I suppose you're right. Okay, I'll at least go check him out. I guess it can't really hurt.
What are the speakers mainly discussing? Why does Julia encourage Kama to go to the Student Counseling Center? What is Kama's initial reaction to going to the Student Counseling Center? Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Yeah, I guess. But I bet it costs a lot. I just don't have much money to spend these days.
Actually, it's one of the resources we pay for with our student services fee every semester. I mean, there's a limit as to how often you can go in a semester, but at least you can get some kind of help at no extra cost.
What does Julia imply about the Student Counseling Center? What does Kama say are her primary symptoms? Track 5.
Excuse me, Professor. You wanted to speak with me?
Yes, Matthew, please come in, have a seat.
Thank you. I got the note in my mailbox. Is everything okay?
Well, Matthew, I wanted to talk to you about your grade in my class.
Oh?
I'm concerned. I haven't seen you in class much lately, and you know that participation is a significant portion of your final grade. Plus, if you're not in class, I'm afraid you won't learn the material well enough to get a good enough grade on the final to pass the class.
Yes, ma'am. I understand. It's just, I've had to pick up more shifts at work because my dad lost his job, and I'm trying to help pay the bills.
Okay, well, that's a tough position to be in. So let me ask, are evenings easier for you to attend class? If so, you can come to my Thursday evening class section for the rest of the semester. But I need you to commit to being there every week through the end of the term.
Oh, yes. That would work much better for me. I can absolutely be there for all the remaining classes. Thank you so much.
Well, I also need you to know that you'll learn the material that you've missed in the last few classes. Can you make my Friday afternoon office hours? I'm willing to meet with you to review the material if you're willing to catch up on the reading you've missed.
Yes, I can definitely make the Friday afternoon office hours. If we can start next week, I promise I'll get all of the reading done from the classes I missed.
Well, very well then. I'll see you in class this Thursday evening and next, and then I'll see you in office hours next Friday with all of the reading under your belt.
Why does the professor want to talk with the student? What explanation does the student offer in response to the professor's concern? What does the professor offer as the first step in a plan to help the student? What else does the student commit to in order to ensure he passes the class? Listen again to part of the conversation.
Plus, if you're not in class, I'm afraid you won't learn the material well enough to get a good enough grade on the final to pass the class.
What does the Track 6. Listen to a lecture on music history.
One of the most interesting aspects of history is the exploration of how artists expressed their political opinions in their art, particularly when people didn't feel they could speak their minds without recrimination. Among those expressions were music composers who incorporated ideas and motifs of a nationalistic style into their compositions. These themes, such as folk songs, can be associated with particular countries or regions of countries and are therefore part of a country's identity. Frédéric Chopin was one of the earliest composers to incorporate nationalistic ideas into his music, which was written primarily for solo piano. Born in Poland in 1810, Chopin grew up in a country that found itself controlled politically by Russia, Austria, and Prussia. As a result, he felt compelled to incorporate many elements of traditional Polish music in his compositions, in essence, in an effort to maintain the Polish identity despite non-Polish rule. A particularly remarkable example of his use of folk music elements is in his mazurkas, of which he wrote at least 69 for piano. These are a variation of their original structure, which was a folk dance from Poland's Mazovia region. These folk dances were traditionally played on bagpipe and fiddle. Chopin borrowed the same rhythmic structures employed in the folk dances and used those as the basis for his mazurkas. The end results are not really intended as music for dancing and are definitely more technically sophisticated, but the underlying rhythms and melodies are clearly identifiable. Closer to home, we also see obvious nationalistic tendencies in 20th century jazz music. Interestingly, though, these tendencies are split along ethnic lines, the white American influence and the African American influence. Particularly intriguing is the fact that this divide came about in a country that for so long had prided itself on welcoming people of all backgrounds, going so far as to call itself a melting pot. So, what do I mean by saying that the nationalism in jazz is split along ethnic lines? Well, check this out. Jazz originally came out of spiritual songs slaves would sing. In the 1920s, what was really the heart of the jazz age, so to speak, these spirituals were recorded and marketed directly as race music and were directly marketed toward members of the African American community. So, this begs the question, why would an art form that was reminiscent of slavery be marketed toward African Americans decades after the abolition of slavery? I think it's because that's part of the national identity that former slaves and their first couple of generations of descendants could identify as their own. Interestingly, Louis Armstrong, himself an African American, was a popular jazz artist among both African Americans and white Americans, but his form of jazz totally ignored any musical elements of the slave spiritual. He crossed the divide, so to speak. As jazz evolved, it continued to establish and support the desires of the African American community, especially during a time when segregation was still common and racism widespread. At the pinnacle of the free jazz movement, for example, ideals such as self-sufficiency and a non-European ideal underscored the efforts of many independent recording facilities, not just those of the musicians themselves.
What is the lecture mainly about? According to the professor, which of the following did composers include in their music to represent their national identities? Why does the professor believe that African Americans were interested in purchasing recordings of slave spirituals? Listen again to part of the lecture.
So, what do I mean by saying that the nationalism in jazz is split along ethnic lines? Well, check this out. Jazz originally came out of spiritual songs slaves would sing.
What did the professor mean by this?
Check this out.
Why did the professor think it was interesting that Louis Armstrong was popular among both white Americans and African Americans? Click on 2 answers. Why does the professor... Track 7.
Obesity. Pretty much everyone recognizes it's a serious problem. Recent statistics indicate that nearly 78 million adults and 13 million children in the U.S. alone deal with the physical and emotional effects of obesity every day. It would seem like the solution is easy, wouldn't it? Eat less and move more. Or in other words, consume fewer calories and increase the number of calories burned through physical activity. And yet, more than 90 million Americans continue to battle the bulge. So what makes it so difficult to lose weight? Experts believe there are a number of contributing factors. One consideration is that for some folks, the system that sends signals back and forth between organs, such as the stomach and the brain, is out of whack. So what can happen is that when the stomach sends a signal to the brain to stop taking in food, the brain doesn't recognize it, and so the person just keeps eating. And as if that alone wasn't bad enough, at the end of a meal, the reward system can come into play. How so, you ask? Well, think about the last time you were at a restaurant and you were convinced that you were absolutely stuffed. And then the waitress brought over the dessert tray. Those desserts, they look pretty tempting, didn't they? It turns out that's because of your reward system. It can make you want to eat whether you're hungry. Reward system. It can make you want to eat whether you're hungry or not when you see or smell appetizing food. So no wonder reducing the number of calories consumed can be so challenging. So, we're eating too much. But experts also believe we're eating too much of the wrong foods, too. Most folks eat more than they should of red meat, unhealthy fats, refined grains, and processed food. Never mind the fast food options. So what that ends up meaning is that we're eating fewer healthy foods like fruits and vegetables, whole grains and nuts. And without these foods in our diet, we're not getting all of the nutrition that our body needs. Some experts believe this causes us to eat even more of those same unhealthy foods in a desperate attempt to get all of the nutrients that it craves. Experts also believe that societal factors may contribute to the difficulty in losing weight. So think back to that last dinner at the restaurant again. Think about the size of your meal. Would you be surprised to learn that in the last 50 years, restaurant portions have quadrupled in size? And we haven't even talked about the increase in the size of beverages. Serving sizes of beverages have actually increased by a factor of 6 in the exact same time frame. But wait, there's more. It's not all about calories in. It's also about calories out. Today's Americans move a whole lot less than those of 50 years ago did. Our jobs require us to sit behind desks more. We spend more of our downtime behind a screen of some variety, surfing the web or streaming a show on a laptop or tablet, watching TV or playing games on a phone. We meet friends for coffee instead of going for a hike. We commute to work and school in cars rather than on bicycles or by using our own 2 feet. And then there's also speculation that our lifestyles themselves are contributing to our weight gain. Our stress levels are higher than ever before, so we're not sleeping, which knocks more than just our eating systems off course. We're tired, so we reach for sugary, caffeinated drinks. Then we race through these fast food lunches because we have to get back to our desks. We have to spend extra time at our desks doing our work because we're not as productive as we'd like to be. And we're not as productive as we'd like to be because we're tired. And so it begins all over again. So, what's the solution? Well, experts disagree there too. From my experience, it starts with small changes that can help knock you out of your rut. Something as simple as committing to walking 15 minutes a day at lunchtime, or drinking a full glass of water for every glass of soda you drink can be the starting point. For some folks, it's all it takes. For others, there's more involved to ultimately regain a healthy weight. But one thing is for sure, there's no single formula that works for everyone.
What is the lecture mainly about? Which of the following is true according to the professor? Listen again to part of the lecture.
One consideration is that for some folks, the system that sends signals back and forth between organs, such as the stomach and the brain, is out of whack. So what can happen is that when the stomach sends a signal to the brain to stop taking in food, the brain doesn't recognize it, and so the person just keeps eating.
What did the professor mean by this?
Out of whack.
What does the professor suggest as a viable weight loss solution? Which of the following are possible contributing factors to the obesity epidemic? What does the professor believe Track 8?
Since yesterday's brief introduction on the origin of banking confused some of you, today I would like to review it a little bit. Banking, the way we know it today, is a convenience. The money used in banking represents a certain amount of value, but the money itself isn't valuable. It's just paper. To see how we got here, suppose we think about a society far, far back in history. What would it have used before the paper money we have today?
Didn't they trade with the goods themselves?
Sure. The system of exchanging one good for another of equal value is called bartering. Bartering was common in early societies, first with essential goods, then with non-essential goods. By non-essential, I mean, for example, art or cultural objects. You might trade a curtain that had been dyed in a decorative pattern for some wheat. The curtain's decorative value isn't essential to survival the way the food value of the grain is. That's the first step toward a money economy, recognizing trade-worthy value in something that isn't essential to survival. Of course, you may see a hitch. Different cultures don't value the same decorations, so something could be worth a lot to one tribe and nothing to another. With food, that's not a problem. Everyone has to eat. But with non-essential items, you're going to use something with cross-cultural value. Can anyone think of anything that would work?
How about gold? It's durable, easy to shape, and it's beautiful. Is that why cultures started using it as money?
Well, you can't refer to the earliest trade with gold as a money economy, but yes, gold is a perfect example. As societies grew, gold is a perfect example. As societies grew more stable and trade flourished, gold, usually molded into small ingots, gradually replaced the system of bartering. There were problems with gold, though.
Yeah, I was going to say, gold is heavy, isn't it? I mean, how did people carry enough of it around to buy things? And wasn't it dangerous? Like, you'd get robbed if people knew you had money with you?
Definitely. Hauling all your gold around was a real risk in early societies, when there were bandits roaming around and no police to help you. And as you say, gold is heavy and unwieldy. One advantage it has, though, is that unlike livestock or food, it doesn't go bad. So you don't have to use it up immediately. That combination of characteristics gave people an idea. They started leaving their gold ingots with gold specialists for safekeeping. The specialists stored the gold for a small fee, and they gave their customers receipts, the way you'd get today. So you'd get something that said that, you were the owner of such and such an amount of gold stored at this particular shop. The quality of gold from different mines varies, so the purity and density of your gold ingots, how heavy they were for their size, determined their value and would also be recorded. Then when you wanted to use it, you just went back, gave the shopkeeper the receipt, and he gave you your gold.
So, if you were storing 500 ounces of gold of whatever percent purity, you'd give the receipt back and get your 500 ounces of gold back? They kept it for you in your own little drawer or something?
Oops, no, I guess I did make it sound that way. Thanks for catching that. No, you'd get 500 ounces of gold of the same purity back. They would have equal value, but would not necessarily be the exact same pile of ingots that you originally gave to the shopkeeper.
So the shopkeeper would use the gold or lend it out while you were storing it?
Sure. And you can see how that's another of the beginnings of banking as we know it. You wouldn't get back your very own pile of gold. You'd get back a pile of equal value. It was the value itself that was important.
So how did it become like money? I mean, we're still talking about big, heavy stacks of things, and none of that seems like it's...
Well, that's the last point. Eventually, people figured out that they could use their receipts from storing gold to trade with one another. If they wanted to buy something, instead of running to the gold shop, withdrawing gold and bringing it to another shop to pay for food or clay pots or whatever, they just gave the food merchant a receipt for the appropriate amount of gold. The merchant could then cash it in for gold, and the trade would be complete. And that's the last major step. The receipts became the first real ancestor of the money we use today because they stood for value actually attached to goods somewhere else.
According to the professor, why was trade with non-essential goods difficult? Why did people begin relying on gold and gold specialists? Click on 3 answers. How did gold specialists indicate the value of the gold they received? Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
So, if you were storing 500 ounces of gold of whatever percent purity, you'd give the receipt back and get your 500 ounces of gold back? They kept it for you in your own little drawer or something?
What did the professor mean by this?
Oops, no, I guess I did make it sound that way. Thanks for catching that.
Why did the professor say the receipts issued by gold shops? Track 9. Now listen to two students discuss the announcement.
Did you hear the announcement? They're cutting back on computer lab hours.
Yeah, but it's better that they cut down there than at the library or the cafeteria.
Well, maybe for you, but I don't have a computer. I use the computer lab a lot. Plus, I need to have access to a computer for my economics class.
Well, they'll still be open during the week.
I know, but I get most of my work done during the weekend. The labs are usually empty then. They'll probably be filled with students now. It's going to make it really hard for me to get all my classwork done.
Well, I didn't really think of that.
Track 10. Now listen to the following conversation about the announcement.
I think the university's new policy is great.
Really? I think it's going to be annoying. I have some friends visiting, and they're going to have to spend all this time registering. And what if they lose their passes?
True, but that's a minor inconvenience. It's worth it if the campus is safer. Now, remember that vandalism that took place at the library was done by someone from off campus.
Well, I still think the school is overreacting. One bad thing happens and they go and change the policy?
Well, no. There have been other incidents. A couple months ago, there were some things stolen from one of the dorms, and the students reported seeing a suspicious figure.
Well, I guess you're right.
Track 11. Now listen to a professor give a talk about the same topic.
Okay, so we've been talking about some problems faced by biologists when they try to reintroduce species into the wild. As we've talked about, sometimes the animals aren't ready or able to go to fit into their native habitats. But there have been some new strategies used, which seem to be working out. For example, biologists recently reintroduced 4 lynx. You guys all know what a lynx is, right? Into the wild. The first time they tried it, the cats died of starvation. They didn't know how or where to hunt. This time, they kept the animals longer and let them mature. They also forced the animals to hunt for food instead of giving them the food directly. And finally, they kept the lynx together in a big pen so they know how to get along with other members of their species.
Track 12. Now listen to a professor give a talk about the same topic.
So, there's been some interesting news for those of you who dream of life on other planets. It turns out that Mars has a pretty high concentration of methane in its atmosphere. Now, usually when we think of life, we associate it with oxygen, right? But that's because we're kind of prejudiced. A whole host of creatures need no oxygen whatsoever. The reason that this is important is that it looks like Mars has very little geologic activity. Methane can be produced without life, but as far as we know, there are no active volcanoes on Mars. Plus, here's another interesting point. Methane only lasts about 300 years in the atmosphere, so that means the methane we're seeing now is fairly new, and it's being replenished somehow.
Track 13. Listen to a conversation between two students.
It looks like I got a big problem on my hands.
Yeah? What's wrong?
I think I overbooked myself this semester. I took 5 classes, and 2 of them are really demanding. I have 2 really big projects due, and I don't think I can do both of them.
Oh no, it really sounds like you got a lot of stuff on your plate. Have you talked to your professors yet?
No. I don't see how that would help.
Well, you could ask for an extension. Last semester, I asked Professor Miller for an extension on my psychology project. She was really nice about it and gave me 2 more weeks to finish it.
I could do that. But I can't take extensions forever. The fact is, I still have a lot of work to do for these classes.
I guess. But it could help you open up your schedule for now so you're not so stressed out, you know?
Right.
Of course, there is one other option, but it's kind of drastic. You could drop one of the classes and take it next semester. It's still early enough to do it.
That could work, but I don't really want to think about it. But I may have to.
Track 14. Listen to a conversation between two students.
Did you hear about the school's new parking policy? It's going to be a problem.
No, I don't drive. So what's the deal with it?
Well, they changed the rules so that freshmen have to park all the way down near the athletic center. Oh, it's so far away.
Why did they do that?
I don't know. I think because the seniors have complained that there's not enough parking on the main campus. All I know is that it's going to be a big inconvenience for me.
Is there anywhere else you can park? I mean, the athletic center is pretty far. And maybe you can park off campus.
I don't know. I think I'd be afraid that something would happen to my car. I don't use it all the time, so it would be unattended for a lot of the time.
I guess I didn't think of that. I have an idea. Maybe you could find a garage for the car. It probably wouldn't cost any more than you pay for a parking tag.
Maybe, but I'd have to find a garage close enough to campus that I could walk to.
Track 15. Listen to a lecture given in a sociology class.
Now, oftentimes when we think of the internet, we think of it as the ultimate expression of free speech. There's no regulation of content on the internet. People and organizations can put anything they want on the web. Also, the internet allows access to a huge amount of information. You can find almost anything you want there. But social scientists have argued that the internet is actually responsible for a new type of censorship. In most cases, censorship involves the suppression of ideas. But the internet censors material in a different way. According to these sociologists, the censorship found on the internet is subtle, but just as bad as any form of censorship. Basically, the internet censors viewpoints by having too much information. That's right. Because the internet contains information from companies, organizations, individuals, and even the government, any one viewpoint or idea can easily be buried under the tide, meaning that no one is ever exposed to it. Another way the internet increases censorship is that because it is so vast, information becomes harder to find. Popular search engines direct users to the most popular websites, and very seldom do people take the time to look at any more than the first 2 or 3 sites listed. Thus, these search engines are practicing an electronic form of censorship. Unpopular ideas are hidden and inaccessible to the average user.
Track 16. Listen to a talk given in an anthropology class.
All cultures partake in certain rituals and ceremonies. Although these rituals and ceremonies may sometimes seem hard to decipher, the essence of these actions is representation. The motions and the items used in the ceremony or ritual stand in for or symbolize something else. Usually the members of the ritual are trying to control or affect something that lies outside of their power, such as the weather or the gods. So they must use symbols to stand in for it. For example, the Diary people of Central Australia use a very symbolic rainmaking ceremony. First, the rainmakers are bled. Their blood drips into a hole in the ground, which represents rain dropping from the sky. Next, the rainmakers take 2 rounded stones, which stand for clouds, and carry them some distance away. They then place the stones high up in a tree, which symbolize the height of the clouds in the sky. Or, for example, there's the fairly common ceremony in which a victim is chosen to symbolize all the sins and wrongdoings of a culture. The victim is then cleansed, either through a ritual bath or through death, in order to wash away the sins of the people. In fact, this is where the term scapegoat comes from, because one culture used a goat as its ceremonial symbol.
Track 17. If you had an entire month to do whatever you would like to do, what would it be? Include details and examples to support your selection. Track 18. Some people believe that same-sex schools are more effective, whereas other people believe that schools with both boys and girls are better. Which approach do you think is better and why? Include details and examples in your response. Track 19. The University of Hartsdale has responded to budget constraints by eliminating some academic departments from its College of Liberal Arts. The campus newspaper printed the following report about the announcement of the department cuts. You have 45 seconds to read the report. Begin reading now. Now listen to two students as they discuss the announcement.
Did you see about those 3 departments being cut next year? It's a shame.
Maybe. But there were only 2 or 3 professors in each of those programs, and none of them are being let go. They're just being moved to bigger departments, like the folklore professors are going to be in anthropology. They'll still do the same research and teach the same classes.
They haven't let any professors go? I thought this was supposed to save money.
Well, it will. Each department has to have an administrative office with a secretary and a budget manager. Those things add up. Moving the professors to bigger departments means big savings on operations.
But it still means students have fewer options for majors, right?
You could say that, I guess. On the other hand, each of those departments only had, 1 major per year to begin with. They just weren't very popular. I really don't think we're going to be losing any important scholarship just because those things aren't full departments anymore.
The man explains his opinion of the announcement made by the College of Liberal Arts. State his opinion and explain the reasons he gives for holding that opinion. Track 20. Now read the passage about surgery to replace heart valves. You have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to a part of a lecture on this topic given in a biology class.
So, people with defective heart valves need them replaced. And what's often used is the heart valve from a pig. It's called a porcine valve because of that. A pig's valve is very similar to a person's. And because pig valves are natural and tend to be accepted by the body, patients who receive them require little treatment after surgery, relatively, for transplant patients, I mean. Now, there are problems. For example, pig valves tend to last around 10 years, not very long. Actually, now that I'm on that topic, I might mention that porcine valves are not the only option. Alternative valves have been developed that are entirely artificial. They're made of plastic and metal. Now, these valves can last for decades, certainly a lot longer than pig valves, but the human body recognizes that plastic and metal are artificial. So what happens is that blood sticks to them, and blood clots form around them. These clots are dangerous because they can block the flow of blood. For that reason, patients who receive artificial valves spend the rest of their lives taking drugs that prevent blood from clotting. Now, the drugs can be tough for the body to handle, but they're worth it for the sake of having a functioning heart valve.
The professor discussed the characteristics of 2 kinds of heart valves. Explain how their characteristics are related to their suitability for younger and older transplant patients. Track 21. Now listen to a conversation between 2 students.
How's that paper coming along, Chris?
Coming along? You're joking, right?
Stuck, huh?
Yeah. The problem is I can't get started. I mean, I have all the information I want to use. That's the frustrating thing. For once, I started my research early rather than leaving it to the last minute.
Okay. Have you considered just sitting at the computer and making yourself type? Sometimes that helps if you have writer's block.
Just typing whatever comes to mind?
Uh-huh. You can't force inspiration, but if you just let yourself relax and let your thoughts flow and type them out, you'll eventually get into the rhythm and you'll start writing good stuff for your paper.
I don't know.
Okay. Well, the other thing is, what about making an outline?
An outline?
Sure. Your research is done, right? So take your note cards and organize them on paper first. See, here's the main point I want to make in this paragraph, and here are the 3 details I want to use to support it.
Oh, I see.
And if you do that for each section of your paper, you have the structure all mapped out. And when you're writing, you just need to connect the pieces. It can be a lot easier to deal with.
The speakers discussed 2 possible solutions for Chris's problem. Describe the problem. Then state which of the 2 solutions you prefer and explain why. Track 22. Now listen to part of a talk in an archaeology class.
Most gems weren't formed by life processes, so they're very durable. If you're one of the lucky few archaeologists who discover an ancient crown inlaid with, say, rubies, you'll probably have to worry more about damage to the metal than to the stones themselves. But some gemstones are organic. They're more fragile and can present special problems if you've dug them up and need to preserve them. One example is amber, which formed millions of years ago from tree sap. The tree sap breaks down on exposure to air, but if the tree died and was buried in an airtight space before decaying, the sap could harden into amber. That's where amber gets its liquid clarity and smoothness. Now, once it's hardened, you don't need to worry about oxygen breaking it down. What you do need to worry about is, think of it as being like hardened wax. If it comes too near to heat, it might melt or deform. Also, contact with oils or strong acids can injure the surface and make it cloudy. The basic thing to remember is avoid sudden temperature changes and any contact with cleaning solutions and other such chemicals. Another organic gem is coral. Coral is sort of the skeleton of creatures from the ocean floor, made of calcium carbonate, often with keratin mixed in. That's what makes it pinkish and orangish. You don't have to worry about melting coral, but you do have to worry about scratching it. Calcium carbonate is naturally rather powdery, so it chips easily. Also, it's very porous, so it absorbs liquids quickly. You need to make sure you never soak coral in water, or pour chemicals over it.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain how archaeologists must take the origins of amber and coral into consideration. Track 23. Now read the passage about the first grain-based food. You have 3 minutes to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
Conventional wisdom says that a very primitive kind of bread was the first grain food that human societies ate. But, for the last few decades, there's been an alternative hypothesis that quite a few anthropologists are starting to give a closer look. That hypothesis says that it was, in fact, beer, not bread, that was the first grain food. Sounds strange? Consider a couple things. For one thing, you don't have to grind wheat to make it easier to eat. If you keep it in a moist environment, it naturally starts sprouting, with a new baby plant splitting the hard seed case in half. Sprouted wheat is sweeter, softer, and actually more nutritious than whole wheat seeds, and it would have developed without human effort. In order to discover the usefulness of ground wheat, someone had to get the bright idea of crushing it. To discover the usefulness of sprouted wheat, people just had to do nothing and let it sit. Which do you think happened first? Another thing, what turns grain into beer is fermentation, and wheat begins to ferment almost as soon as it's stored from water and yeast in the air. After the wheat sprouted, it would have started to ferment. The process would have been obvious because of the bubbles and foam that formed. People could have experimented by tasting it and discovering the first beer. And even if you assume that people were already grinding wheat to paste, think about it. The paste ferments and bubbles. Is it likely that early peoples would have thought to fire it before eating? We're used to cooking our food, but in prehistoric times, the idea that you would take fire to food to improve it for eating was not obvious.
Summarize the points made in the lecture you just heard, explaining how they cast doubt on the contents of the reading. You may refer to Track 24. Listen to part of a conversation at a university library.
Hi, may I speak to the archives librarian?
I'm the archives librarian. What can I help you with?
Well, actually, I'm not a student here. I'm studying history at State U across town, but there's a collection.
Oh, wait. Are you the, sorry, I don't remember your name, but the librarian over there, asked me about giving someone access to the Jacobson collection. Is that you?
Yes, that's right. See, my paper is on the development of the coal mining industry here in the city, and the Jacobson collection has a lot of information about John Jacobson, like when he founded the company and things, right?
Yes, it does. More than you'll be able to fit into a paper, I'd bet. Did your librarian explain what our system is here?
Well, a little. She told me to make sure I brought my college ID so I could get in the door.
Yes, we'll need to take a copy of it too. Even our own students who look at items from our archive collections have to leave a copy of their ID with us. You'll also have to sign into the archives room whenever you enter and sign out whenever you leave. There's a desk, for security.
Wow, so a lot of this stuff is valuable?
Well, I don't know whether you'd get much money for it, but a lot of it is one of a kind. So if it were taken, that's it. It would be gone.
I'll be careful.
Thank you. The other thing is, the things in the Jacobson collection are over 100 years old, so I'll have to ask you to wear special gloves while handling the books. And also, I'm afraid you won't be able to photocopy anything.
Nah, I figured that. I can get everything I need on note cards, but suppose there's a page or two I really want a copy of. Can I don't know, take a picture or something?
Well, I can't let you take a picture, but we have scans, images of all the pages in the collection. You can buy a print of any page you want, but they're expensive, $5 a piece. So be sure you know which pages you want before you ask for them.
$5? Well, I guess given how rare these things are. Okay, so you want a copy of my ID, and then can you tell me how to get to the archives room so I can get started?
What does the student plan to write her paper on? What security procedures does the librarian tell the student she must follow? Click on 2 answers. Why does the librarian say the archives need to be kept secure? Why did the librarian mention the age of the books? Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Well, I can't let you take a picture, but we have scans, images of all the pages in the collection. You can buy a print of any page you want, but they're expensive, $5 a piece. So be sure you know which pages you want before you ask for them.
$5? Well, I guess given how rare these things are. Okay.
What did the student mean by this?
Well, I guess
Track 25. Listen to a professor lecture on the process of memory.
A popular saying goes, "An elephant never forgets." But how about people? Have you ever forgotten the name of someone you just met at a party? Sure, we all have. This is because our memories are complex processes. We're not going to be able to talk much about the physiology of memory here, both because, well, it's not our subject, and because there's a lot we still need to learn about how the brain stores things. One thing we do know is that the mechanism isn't simple. When researchers scan the brain as a memory is forming, parts seem to light up. And by light up, I mean, become active in random scattered formations. But of course, they can't be random because memory produces very orderly results. One researcher, this is Walter Freeman of the University of California at Berkeley, he compares it to 2 kinds of crowds. The impulses in the brain look completely random, like the movement of a mob of people who are frightened. They just keep moving and they're not really going anywhere and there's no pattern in their movement. That's the way impulses in the brain look at first. But since memory does in fact work, the impulses must be moving more like people in a crowded train station. If you've got people running in and out and from one train line to another, it seems like complete confusion. But really, they all know where they're going. They're following a set of instructions. The timetable for the trains, the board that tells which track is for which train, all that stuff. So you have to look carefully to see that there's actually organization, system involved. That's how memory impulses must function. Now, Freeman figures we just haven't figured out what the timetable and track numbers are. So we'll leave the physiology there. We're going to talk about the psychology of memory, the actual process. Psychologists divide memory into 3 stages: registration, long-term retention, and recall. In the initial stage, registration, information is perceived and understood, like when you first hear a name or address. This information is then retained in the short-term memory system. Unfortunately, the short-term memory is limited to the amount of material it can store at one time. And unless refreshed by constant repetition, the new contents are lost within minutes when replaced by even newer information. So to solve this dilemma, the information needs to be transformed into the second stage, long-term retention. The conversion to the long-term retention stage is most easily accomplished using what the research team labeled association. Associating the new information with the visual imagery evoked by it gives the individual a sort of memory crutch to rely on. For example, let's say you're at a party and you've just met a woman named Lily. Now, to remember her name, visualize it in connection to the flower, the lily. Oh, and be sure to make it outlandish, kind of silly even. Those images are most memorable. Picture her with a big basket of lilies, or wearing a hat with a lily on it, or even sitting inside a giant lily. The third stage, recall, is when the information stored through long-term retention at an unconscious level is then deliberately brought into the conscious mind. However, this final stage primarily depends on how well the material was stored in stage 2. Of course, there are disturbances that may affect the recall stage. Age, for example. The older a person gets, the less new information he can recall. Disuse is another example. Here, forgetting occurs because stored information is not used and therefore is lost. Memory loss can also be physiological. If a person receives an injury to the head, he may experience what is known as amnesia. The failure to remember certain or even all events preceding the accident. Of course, many self-help books on how to improve your memory have been published, and many other mnemonic methods have been tried and tested. Let's take a closer look at some of the widely accepted approaches to memory enhancement. Perhaps you may even incorporate some of them into your study habits as you prepare for the upcoming finals.
What is the lecture mainly about? Why does the professor say Walter Freeman mentioned 2 types of crowds? What is the initial stage of memory called? Listen again to part of the lecture.
For example, let's say you're at a party and you've just met a woman named Lily. Now, to remember her name, visualize it in connection to the flower, the lily. Oh, and be sure to make it outlandish, kind of silly even. Those images are most memorable. Picture her with a big basket of lilies, or wearing a hat with a lily on it, or even sitting inside a giant lily.
What is the professor trying to illustrate? What does the professor imply about a memory that has passed through the long-term track 26? Listen to part of a class discussion on the different types of joints.
Now, I know that most of you are healthy individuals who participate in some sort of physical activity pretty regularly. Some of you jog, others bicycle. You might throw the frisbee around with your friends or rollerblade. Our movements are so easy and fluid that you might not have stopped to think that the system of joints that makes them possible is highly complex. A joint is the place where 2 or more bones connect. And because that's the technical definition, it actually includes some places that don't move. Since it's movement we're interested in, I won't spend much time on the immovable joints. They're called fibrous joints. The reason that, they're joined together by bone fibers. It's kind of like welding or soldering 2 pieces of metal together. There are fibrous joints, for example, between the different bones that make up the top part of your skull. that those bones don't move, right? I'm talking about the top of your head. Forget your jaw for a second. If your jaw had fibrous joints, you couldn't talk. The round dome of the skull is made of several bone plates with fibers holding them together. Okay, so those are the fibrous joints. The other joints, the ones we're interested in, are movable. In a movable joint, the bones aren't fused to each other. They're held together with ligaments. Ligaments are long and flexible. They're kind of like ropes or cables. But because the bones have to slide or rub over each other when the joint moves, it also needs to be cushioned against abrasion. These joints are categorized by the types of tissues used to keep them working smoothly. Cartilaginous joints have a tough, smooth lining over the parts of the bone. It's like a pad or cushion. It protects the bone from friction that could wear it down or cause it to splinter. And in fact, if this cartilage, the protective tissue is called cartilage, if it becomes worn or damaged, joint movement may be painful or severely restricted because now you have bone hitting bone. And that's because cartilaginous joints are tight. The bones fit very closely together. For example, the bones in your spine. Some joints require more movement. They're called synovial joints. There has to be a space between the bones, a joint cavity. Those more mobile joints, in addition to being padded with cartilage, are lubricated with liquid that flows through the cavity. The knuckles of your fingers are examples of synovial joints. Of course, the fluid has to be held in place. Otherwise, it'll seep into the surrounding tissues and be absorbed back into the body. And what holds it in place is a little membrane-lined sac called a bursa. So, the joint is encased in this membrane, and the membrane is a pocket for that lubricating fluid. By the way, the fluid also keeps the joint nourished. It doesn't have an independent blood supply in adults, so the fluid absorbs nutrients from the blood through the joint's outer membrane. That's a synovial joint. Tony, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm kind of confused. When we learned about the joints in high school, I don't remember talking about them this way. I thought we talked about them more like machines, like the directions in which they moved.
We're getting to that. Okay, now that we have joints categorized by how their surfaces are put together, fibrous, synovial, and cartilaginous, we can talk about how the movable joints actually move. I mentioned your knuckles a few minutes ago, and they're good examples of hinge joints. They work kind of like the hinge on a door, so the joint can flex and extend in one direction only. But hinge joints aren't the only movable joints in the body. The hip, as well as the shoulder, is an example of the ball and socket joint. The ball and socket joint allows the greatest range of movement, and therefore it has to be the most anatomically complex. In a ball and socket, one bone has a rounded knob at the end, and it fits snugly into the socket, a round cavity of another bone. The ball and socket joint is a type characteristically found in more evolved creatures, such as apes and us, humans. It allows you to move through 360 degrees of motion, the way you can wind your arm back before you throw a ball. While we're at it, can anyone think of another type of joint?
Well, I know that when I rollerblade, I have to turn my head constantly to make sure I don't crash into anyone. But the neck doesn't seem to be an example of either a hinge joint or a ball and socket joint.
Good example, Louise. The neck is actually a type of pivot joint. Pivot joints permit rotation, the way you can twist your head around. Well, it doesn't go all the way around, but it moves around your neck. It pivots on an axis.
What is the discussion mainly about? What is special about fibrous joints? Listen again to part of the discussion.
There are fibrous joints, for example, between the different bones that make up the top part of your skull. And those bones don't move, right? I'm talking about the top of your head. Forget your jaw for a second. If your jaw had fibrous joints, you couldn't talk.
What does the professor say about the jaw? According to the professor, what is an example of a hinge joint? Why must the ball and socket joint be very complex? The professor categorizes joints by how they are held together. Indicate whether each track 27. Listen to part of a discussion in a class on English literature.
Everyone here? Okay. I hope you all did the readings for this week. I know it's midterm time and you're all busy, but Robert Browning is one of the most important poets in the history of English literature. He deserves all your attention. Actually, it's usually not hard to sell Browning on my students, I find. His poetry really draws people in. So what did all of you think?
Well, you're certainly right that it draws you in, but I have to say it really confused me at first.
What was it that confused you?
Well, I mean, the poems we've read so far have been... It's like the poet is just kind of writing the poem. The poems we read by this Browning guy, it took me a few minutes to realize that he was using the voice of some historical character. It was supposed to be someone else speaking.
Sure. The reason I assigned this particular set of poems by Browning was so you could see what his most famous style was. He perfected a style called the dramatic monologue, and its major features are what you saw in the readings. It's called dramatic because a poem of this type takes place at some sort of dramatic moment in the middle of a story. And a monologue is a long speech given by an individual, right? And so are these poems. You have Browning writing as if he were a different person, usually someone from history speaking at length. And he talks about something that's happening to him when the poem takes place.
Professor, I kind of cheated and looked up information about Browning when I did the readings. I was like Karen, I was really confused at first. It seems strange that this form of poetry, the dramatic monologue, is so new. But Browning only lived in the 19th century. Was he really the first person to develop a kind of poetry where he pretended to be someone from history giving a speech? It surprised me It surprised me to read that.
Well, you see, the dramatic monologue is actually a more complex style of poetry than it might seem to be at first. For one thing, a lot of poems are addressed to the world in general, sort of, but a dramatic monologue isn't. The speaker in a dramatic monologue is addressing a particular person involved in the story. So, for example, in the poem My Last Duchess, the Duke is doing the speaking, and he's specifically speaking to a servant of his future father-in-law. That's important. A lot of the poem doesn't make sense unless you bear in mind that he's trying to give a message to the father of his new wife.
Yeah, it took me a while to figure that out. And then when I realized what was going on, it really creeped me out. I mean, did I read it right? He seemed to be admitting
Karen,
that he was...
why don't we hold off on analyzing the poem too much for right now? I don't want to shut you down, but I do want to stick to the general structure of the poems for a bit. I will say that when Karen talks about finding the poem a little spooky, part of that probably comes from the fact that, well, you figure within the poem, the speaker is talking to someone in particular. So when you read the poem, you kind of take that person's role, the role of the person being addressed. That's one chief characteristic of the dramatic monologue. Now, obviously, the other thing Karen was probably unsettled by in the case of My Last Duchess is that the Duke doesn't sound like a very nice character. We know that because of another key element of the dramatic monologue. What the speaker says is designed to make an argument. He's trying to persuade the listener, and you, the reader by extension, that what he did was right, or that his viewpoint is correct, or whatever. He makes the case, kind of like a lawyer with a judge or a jury, and in process he reveals his way of thinking. Something of his psychology. And you have to decide whether you believe him.
It's kind of hard because I felt like a whole lot of the story was missing. The speaker in the poem only told his side of things, and you got the feeling that there had to be more going on, but it was all just guesswork.
Now you see why I said the form was complex, huh? Sure, you have to fill in the backstory yourself, and that's the third big characteristic of a dramatic monologue. Now, with those things in mind, let's look at the actual poems you read for this week.
What is the main topic of the discussion? Listen again to part of the discussion, then answer the question.
Okay, I hope you all did the readings for this week. I know it's midterm time and you're all busy, but Robert Browning is one of the most important poets in the history of English literature. He deserves all your attention. Actually, it's usually not hard to sell Browning on my students, I find. His poetry really draws people in.
What did the professor mean by this?
Actually, it's usually not hard to sell Browning on my students, I find. His poetry really draws people in.
According to the professor, what is a monologue? According to the professor, what are the primary characteristics of the poetic form called the dramatic monologue? Click on 3 answers. What was the woman's reaction to the poem My Last Duchess? Listen again to part of the discussion, then answer the question.
It took me a while to figure that out. And then when I realized what was going on, it really creeped me out. I mean, did I read it right? He seemed to be admitting
Karen,
that he was...
why don't we hold off on analyzing the poem too much for right now? I don't want to shut you down, but I do want to stick to the general structure of the poem.
Track 28. Listen to a conversation on a college campus.
So, hey, Amy, a bunch of us are going to probably ditch the dining hall and go for pizza tonight. If you're free, you can meet us at the Eastgate at 7.
You know, I'd love to, but I have tutoring tonight.
Tutoring? I can't imagine you needing help with a class.
The tutoring I'm talking about is tutoring I'm doing for someone else. Though now that you mention it, physics has been giving me more problems than usual this semester.
I find that hard to believe. So are you tutoring one of the lower classmen or something?
Actually, no. I go downtown to tutor a few students at the high school.
High school kids? Wow. And math or something?
Right. You probably read about this in the paper, but the city is trying to raise the standards for its math classes. The problem is a lot of the kids are behind when they get to junior high school.
So you help them get caught up?
Basically. I have 3 students for 45 minutes each on Wednesday nights. So I'm there from 6 to 8:30 or so.
Isn't that late for kids to be still at school?
Well, they'd be doing homework at that hour if they were home anyway. The thing is, most of the tutors are students here at the university. So our classes aren't over until late afternoon, and the city education department likes us. We're good at what we do, but we volunteer, so the program doesn't cost a lot. Beyond, the heat and electricity to keep the high school open at night.
Can you afford to take that much time away from your own studying?
Some weeks it is kind of hard, but when I go to grad school, I'm going to have to start teaching physics to students as a professor's assistant anyway. I may as well get used to teaching with easier material and just one student at a time.
And it must be nice to help people.
Definitely. That goes without saying. 45 minutes a week isn't much time, but all 3 of my students have improved in the months we've worked together. It's really inspiring.
Cool.
So anyway, sorry about dinner. It sounds like fun, and if it were any other night...
Hey, I understand. Have fun.
Other night.
Hey, I understand. Have fun. And I guess I'll see you in class tomorrow morning.
What will the woman spend the evening doing? Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Tutoring? I can't imagine you needing help with a class.
The tutoring I'm talking about is tutoring I'm doing for someone else. Though now that you mention it, physics has been giving me more problems than usual this semester.
What did the woman imply when she said this?
Though now that you mention it, physics has been giving me more problems than usual this semester.
Why has the city started the tutoring program? What does the education department like about the tutors? What does the woman... Track 29. Listen to part of a lecture on events leading up to the American Revolution.
Okay. While I think of it, on Tuesday, I was originally going to show you a documentary film about a town in New England that was founded in the colonial period. But it looks like we had a mix-up at the library, and they lent it out to someone. So I won't be able to show you that until Thursday's class. So instead of what I told you before, do the readings over the weekend and be prepared to discuss them on Tuesday. Hope that doesn't inconvenience you. Okay. We're going to be talking about the American Revolution, or what we often call the Revolutionary War. And we'll talk about 2 or 3 laws. The Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and the Stamp Act. They were all enacted soon after the French and Indian War ended in 1763. The British had won the war, and as a consequence, gained a lot of territory. But there was a downside to the victory. The war had cost a lot of money. So British Parliament looked for ways to make sure the trade money from the American colonies came back to Britain. The increased money would help pay for the war. The way the British decided to get the money was to put taxes on certain purchases and to put limits on what kinds of goods the colonists could buy and sell. And that's where the trouble started. The Sugar Act was passed in 1764. It was actually a revised version of an old tax on sugar byproducts like molasses, and it had 2 big effects. One, byproducts like molasses, and it had 2 big effects. One, Parliament lowered the tax on molasses, but increased the tax on sugar and certain kinds of cloth, coffee, some wines, and fruit from the tropics. Second, it made sure the taxes were collected. The old tax on molasses hadn't been enforced very well. Now, what this did was mostly it made it difficult for rich people. They were the ones buying the wines and tropical fruits and refined sugar. So, as you might imagine, it made it difficult to get things they wanted. Now, that same year, Parliament passed the Currency Act. The colonists had to buy most of their goods from home, from England. That took up most of their British currency. So what happened, of course, was that when they wanted to trade with each other within the colonies, they didn't have any money left over to use. That gave them an incentive to come up with their own paper currency. Some was backed by, meaning its value is based on people's property. It was useless for buying things from England. But it was very useful for workers with a little farmland who wanted to pay off their debts quickly. They could use their paper notes and then try to earn back the real value in produce from their farms. What did the Currency Act do? It invalidated all these colonial forms of paper currency. The colonists were told they couldn't use them anymore. So now you have the rich merchants, the traders, angered by the Sugar Act, and you have the laborers in debt who need to rely on paper money, and they're angered by the Currency Act. Okay, so now the third law, the Stamp Act. The Sugar Act put a tax on sugar, so you might think the Stamp Act put a tax on stamps, but that wasn't the idea. The idea was that there would now be a tax on all sorts of official documents that colonists used to get for free. Marriage licenses, newspapers, even playing cards. Well, these were the kinds of things people needed for everyday life. So everyone, merchants and laborers alike, were outraged. Now, I'm leaving out some things in the sequence of events, such as the British government adjusted some of the provisions of these laws when the colonists complained. But the main point I'm trying to make is these laws were meant to get more money, more revenue for the British government to pay for the French and Indian War. But the effect they had on the colonists was to make them feel as if they were being pushed around by a bunch of people in Parliament on the other side of the ocean. Now, up until this point, the taxes in the colonies had been administered by local governments in the colonies themselves. For the first time, Britain not only imposed taxes on the colonists, but showed that it would use force to collect them. And this was the origin of the famous slogan, taxation without representation. And it stoked the movement among the colonists to be free of British rule.
What did the professor mainly discuss? Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Okay. While I think of it, on Tuesday, I was originally going to show you a documentary film about a town in New England that was founded in the colonial period. But it looks like we had a mix-up at the library, and they lent it out to someone. So I won't be able to show you that until Thursday's class. So instead of what I told you before, do the readings over the weekend and be prepared to discuss them on Tuesday. Hope that doesn't inconvenience you.
Why does the professor mention the documentary film? Why did Britain want to receive more money from the American colonies? Which of the following did the professor mention as changes that accompanied the Sugar Act? Click on 2 answers. Why does the professor say the colonists developed their own paper currency? According to the professor, track 30. Now read the passage about birds of prey. You have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture on this topic given in a biology class.
There are 2 bird species found in our local area that I think do a good job of exemplifying the range of ways birds of prey can adapt. One is the bald eagle, and the other is the great blue heron. They both feed largely on fish, and they're both large. But the more closely you observe them, the more the differences show. So the bald eagle is always on the lookout for dead fish at the side of a river or lake, or for fish that it can grab from close to the surface of the water. And that's because it has very sharp eyesight and strong talons. It can swoop down, grab a fish in its claws, and start eating it mid-air. Its beak curves. It has sort of a hook at the end of it, so it can start pulling food into its mouth. Now, the great blue heron might eat those same fish, but it would have to go about it differently. The heron does have good eyesight. It'd be hard to see prey otherwise, right? But its claws aren't as strong as the eagle's. So it usually attacks by diving into the water head first, because the heron has a long, straight beak that it can use either like a spear to impale a fish or like tongs to grab it.
The professor discussed the characteristics of 2 kinds of birds of prey. On the basis of these characteristics, explain whether either bird would be characterized as a raptor. Track 31. The College of Arts and Sciences at Eastern University has decided to add a senior project to its existing graduation requirements. The campus newspaper printed the following report about the announcement of the new requirement. You have 45 seconds to read the report. Begin reading now. Now listen to 2 students as they discuss the report.
Wow, look at this. The dean seems to be serious about tightening graduation requirements. They'll be forcing students to write a senior thesis in order to graduate.
Yeah. I read that at breakfast. It seems a little weird.
Weird? Haven't you seen all those reports about how graduates with poor writing skills are having trouble finding jobs? Companies don't want to hire them. And the ones that want to apply to graduate school, if they can't write, they can't present their research ideas effectively in their essays.
Well, I guess I'm more thinking about the science people. Biology, physics, right? I mean, it seems strange to give them this big paper to do.
Maybe. On the other hand, the paper. See here? It says you have to write a paper or equivalent. So presumably, you can do a project that ends up as a lot of data and stuff. Maybe make it a presentation instead of a paper. But even so, don't biologists have to learn how to write up their research in order to get it published? It seems to me that having a writing requirement is long overdue.
The woman explains her opinion of the announcement made by the College of Arts and Sciences. State her opinion and explain the reasons she gives for holding that opinion. Track 32. Now listen to a conversation between 2 students.
The walls of my dorm room are so thin I can hear everything my neighbors do.
Oh, yeah. You live in one of the newer dorms, huh?
Yep. Their voices and music come right through, even when they're trying to be quiet. I really can't study there anymore.
Well, it's the middle of the semester, and the housing office has some odd rooms and no one's in. They'll let you move if you ask.
I guess. Ugh, it'd be a big project.
Yeah, but if it's affecting your ability to study, there must be somewhere quieter than your room now.
Right.
Or what about studying at a quiet place, like at the library?
I know a lot of people do that. I've just always studied in my room because it's more convenient than dragging all my textbooks and notes and things across campus.
Sure, but you also don't have your TV and stereo with you. I find it much less easy to get distracted when I use the library.
I can see that.
Yeah, right? Yeah, I find that my work gets done much faster, and I remember what I've read better when I study at the library. And the lighting is probably better for your eyes than the lamp in your room.
The speakers discuss two possible solutions for the woman's problem. Describe the problem, then state which of the two solutions you prefer and explain why. Track 33. Now listen to part of a lecture in a history class.
The discovery of copper was a great advance for civilization, but no one is quite sure how it happened. Of course, in nature, metal, like copper, is usually buried in rock. Early humans must have accidentally discovered that heating the rock melted the metal and released it. There are two interesting ways that might have happened. One relates to the use of primitive campfires. Once humans figured out how to control fire for light and heat, they knew that they needed to keep their fires confined. One of the ways they did this was to take stones and cover the fire with them partially. That kept the fire enclosed, and it also made sure it didn't burn too fast and use up the fuel. Now, what do you think might have happened? Some of those stones contained copper, and before the fire died down, it was hot enough to melt the copper out of the stones. When people went back to the fire after it had burned out, they discovered small pieces of shiny metal that had melted out and cooled. There's a second possibility that relates to pottery. Early humans discovered how to make pottery before they learned how to use copper. Of course, to make pottery, you have to bake it in an oven, right? Well, some societies got into the habit of decorating their containers with colored stones before baking them. One of those stones is a mineral called malachite, and malachite contains, that's right, copper. The hot temperature inside the oven released the copper metal from the other ingredients, and when the people took their pottery out of the oven, they found pieces of copper at the bottom.
Using points and examples from the talk, explain the two possible ways early humans discovered how to use fire to release Track 34. Now read the passage about the suppression of forest fires. You have 3 minutes to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
For years, forest fires were regarded as uniformly destructive, and forest managers put a lot of effort into preventing them. But it turns out that fire suppression may have destructive long-term effects on the forest it's supposed to protect. For instance, mature oaks have grown so thickly in some places that little light reaches the forest floor. But young oak trees need light in order to grow properly. The lack of light has meant that the new oaks aren't maturing rapidly enough to replace the older oaks. It also means that other tree species that don't need so much light, such as maples, are invading oak and hickory forests and competing for resources. There are competition problems at ground level, too. What forest fires, both natural and artificial, used to do is burn off some of the plants on the forest floor before they could grow into huge thickets. Now they run wild all over the ground. And again, that means it's hard for young trees and other native plants to grow. Then there's the increase in the deer population. This partially results from the lack of forest fires and partially from limitations on hunting. But the thing is, deer like to eat the leaves off oak saplings. So if one of those little oak seedlings somehow does manage to get a good start, despite the shade and all the other plants competing for nutrients, it's likely to be killed by having its leaves eaten. Oh, and another thing. Scientists are now finding that forest fires release nutrients from the plants and animals that are burned. That means that even though the total amount of nutrients is decreased, there can actually be more nutrients available on the soil surface for plants that are trying to grow back afterward.
Summarize the points made in the lecture you just heard, explaining how they challenge specific claims made in the reading passage. You may refer to